Well, I think he probably, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I would say he was in clinical depression for a couple of years after she died. He wasn't interested in doing anything. He lost a lot of weight. And he just was fixated on the grave. He went every single day to the grave. And in fact, he did that for, I would say, probably he did that for 6 or 7 years. Every single day he would go to the grave. But he did improve. We had him over here in 2 years after she passed away, I think it was. He came over here for 6 weeks. And of course, then he was beyond travel, really. I mean, he wasn't interested. I mean, we did day trips with him. I would take him, down to Peddler's Village in New Hope and up to the Poconos, and took him out to lunch and all that kind of stuff. But he by this time, he was spending a lot of time. I mean, father died when he was 95. So, I mean, he was elderly and he didn't have the energy to do a lot of stuff. He used to sleep a lot, of course. But I think it sort of gave him a rejuvenation, if you want to say it that way, when he came over here, because he was around Don's family, or who are all local, with a lot of the children and grandchildren and cousins and aunts and uncles and so on. So he got to see a lot of other people. And I asked him when he was over here if he would have any interest in doing a family tree, because I realized that once he was gone, there's no more questions, and what you don't know now, you never will. And he did. And in fact, he with my older brother and his wife's help, my sister-in-law Carol was an executive secretary many years ago, and so she was great with typing and all those skills. And my older brother helped with doing a lot of stuff on the computer and a lot of the research, or helped my father with a lot of the research. But my father certainly did an awful lot of it, and he traced back 6 sides of our family tree, and some of them go back to the 1600s. I mean, he really got a long way back with some of them. And some of the stories that we had been told as children turned out absolutely not to be true, which I'm sure happens with a lot of families. But he had such an interest that after he had done this, I went over there one summer and took him to a lot of the locations where his family was from. And he went to the old churches and places that he had been familiar with from doing this tree. So that sort of, I gave him a new zest for life, I think, after that. But he was still the same personality deep down, very much of a loner, and as I say, his health declined. One of his problems was that he was deaf. He had been deaf for quite some time. I don't exactly remember when he first started wearing a hearing aid. I mean, probably was in his late 60s. But he got to the point where hearing aids really didn't help. He was just so deaf. And of course, that really ruined his enjoyment of his music. And in fact, I can remember being over there one summer, or maybe fall. I went to visit, and he was blaming the headphones. And he said, Diane, these headphones, and he had good headphones. He was always very conscious of the people that lived around him. He lived in a condominium. And so he listened to his music with headphones so that he wouldn't have it turned up too loud for other people that, might not share his love of the music. So, but he said, I want you to put these headphones on and tell me if it's me or if it's the head, and it was him, So he ended up really sleeping a lot, and I mean, like a lot of old people, but until the last year of his life, he lived on his own, and he took care of himself, and he managed.
Were you with him when he died?
No. He fell he died in December. He fell the previous March, and he broke his arm, but he broke it very high up. and so it couldn't be put in any kind of a splint or anything. And he ended up staying for an extended period of time in hospital. And then it was obvious that he could no longer go home. And so he did end up in a nursing home. And my husband and I went over to visit in the July of that year, 2011. And by this time, mentally he was fading as well as physically. Physically, he was definitely, you know, I think he just wore out. I mean, he didn't have any specific illnesses or anything, but he was just old. And I knew when we left, I said to my husband, I said, you know, I'm not going to see him again. And I didn't. So, but again, it was good. He died in his sleep, and he didn't suffer an unusually long period of time in a nursing home. So he was very lucky, and he had a good life. I think partly because of coming over here, it made me realize every time I spoke to my parents that it could be the last time. And every time I saw them, I knew it could be the last time. So I think everybody gets irritated with their parents, especially, you know, in later life when they do things that you think are not so great. And it's easy to treat people less than kindly on the telephone at times. We're all short-tempered or irritated about something. But I always made it a point when I spoke to my parents to never leave with any irritation between us or any criticisms, and to always make sure that they knew that I knew they'd done everything they could as parents, and that I'd done what I could to help them as far away as I was. And I had two great brothers and their wives also, who were always very supportive. And even when my parents got sick, or certainly in the last year of my father's life, my brothers never ever said, you know, you're not pulling your weight, or, oh, you know, there was never any challenge between us about how unfair it is that one has to do more than the other or anything. I mean, we were always very comfortable, and they were always very gracious about the fact that they really knew I couldn't do anything to help. So, yeah, I was obviously some people have to go through tremendously long and horrible illnesses with parents. So, I mean, I was very lucky in that way that neither one of them suffered for any great length of time. And that was a great blessing. But I know that everybody, my parents knew how I felt about them, and I certainly knew how they felt about me. Well, we came over here 5 days after we got married. And I think that experience in itself was probably one of the things that broke up our marriage, because we didn't have a big circle of friends and family. I think we underestimated how hard it was going to be on our own, as much as it was a great adventure. And certainly we looked at it that way, and we thought we were extraordinarily lucky. When we first came, as I said, we arrived on Thanksgiving Day, and I remember that the Macy's Day Parade was over, so we didn't get to see that, because I think we got here around 1 o'clock or something like that, so that was already over. But I remember when we got off, we came into JFK, and I remember, and that was the first time either one of us had ever been on an airplane. And I remember when we landed, we got a taxi because we didn't know any other way to get to. We were staying in New York City for a few days as sort of as a honeymoon, before we were then going to Greenwich, Connecticut, which was where my ex-husband's company was at the time. And we got into this taxi, and of course very quickly the taxi driver determined that we were completely green around the girls and completely new to the United States. And so, surprisingly, from what you know of taxi drivers today in New York City, this taxi driver took us on an hour tour of the city, gratis, never charged us, and introduced us to all the highlighted tourist spots of New York City, which we thought was wonderful. I mean, looking back on that, you just can't believe that they would have done, that this taxi driver would have done that, but he did, and that certainly was a great help to us for those few days that we spent in New York, because we knew what we wanted to go back to see. But anyway, we eventually we stayed in Greenwich, Connecticut for just about 6 months, while my husband was he had been hired to move the company from where it was in Old Greenwich down to Allentown, Pennsylvania. And the reason, it was a company that manufactured steam control equipment for industrial purposes, like hotels, hospitals, that kind of thing. And there was a company on Lehigh Street called Sarco, which manufactured these items. And my husband was over here to sell this American product to Central and South America. So he traveled quite often to Central and South America, but when he went, he would go for probably 6 weeks at a time. So he didn't go, I mean, maybe he went, I don't know, once or twice a year, so it wasn't like he was going, constantly traveling. But he did not work in the plant. He worked in an office not too far from Trexler Park. So he worked on his own, just with a secretary. And I couldn't work, which made my life very difficult. I was very lonely. And of course, at that time, I mean, I was only 24 years old, so contemporaries that of mine, who I did get, I mean, obviously we did make some friends. We made friends with a lot of people from Air Products, because in the apartment buildings that we were living in at the time, there were a lot of Air Products young people living there too. So we did make friends, but of course the wives would work at that age in those days. I mean, none of us had children at that point. And so that's when I've really started doing a lot of volunteer work with children. I worked in a church school and taught reading and to elementary age children, reading and arithmetic I was teaching at that time. So I did that. But I think that the loneliness and the lack of family, even though we did have friends, I think that did a lot to burden our marriage, and also the fact that I couldn't have children, or as it turns out, we both could not have children. And you know, back then in the early 70s, people just expected that you had children, and it was always just, well, when are you going to have them? I don't think people made a conscious decision so much as they do today. And the fact that we couldn't have children, you know, I think that played a big part in not that either one of us ever blamed the other, but I think that also had a big impact on our marriage. And I don't exactly know why we fell out of love, or however you want to put it, but we remained good friends, and we just decided that we couldn't go forward. I think we were stuck, kind of thing, and it turned out to be good for both of us, I think. I mean, I still talk to him periodically. He remarried. He lives down in Columbia, South Carolina, and he's now retired, but he's living down there still. Yeah. Well, coming to America was obviously a huge thing, because we thought we were extraordinarily lucky, because the disposable income over here was much, much higher than our way of life turned out to be much better over here than it ever would have been in England. I mean, we would have had a very nice life, and I'm sure we would have been very happy in England. But coming over here, it was like, wow, this really is the American dream. And we could afford to do a lot of things that we'd never even thought about, and have a lot of things that we would never have thought about having. I mean, just stupid things. I mean, when we moved into Trexler Park Apartments, we started off in just a one-bedroom unit when we first came here. We did move to a two-bedroom unit later on, but there was a dishwasher in this apartment. Well, I never even seen a dishwasher, let alone know how to work it. And I remember when we moved in there, I actually had to go to the superintendent and ask him to show. Well, he looked at me like I had three heads, because I didn't know what a dishwasher was. I didn't say that wasn't anything that we would have had. And I mean, refrigerator in England is the size of a dishwasher. And you know, my mother went to the store probably 3 times a week, whereas, you know, here you had this great big thing, and I can remember half the time it was empty, because it was like, what do I put in this? You know, I mean, I didn't have enough stuff to put in it, kind of thing. But the things that you get used to so quickly are all the things that so many people take for granted. I mean, that ice, for instance. Now, I remember ice, of course, now lots of people have ice makers in their refrigerators in this country, and did even back in the early 70s. But ice isn't something that is used anything like to the extent that it is back in England. And I can remember going home and with Don, and we'd go into a pub or somewhere to have a drink, and Don would say, lots of ice. Well, lots of ice in this country means you fill the glass. Lots of ice in England means you get 2 cubes instead of 1. So, I mean, those were the kinds of things that you don't realize until you come to a country like this. And I wasn't leaving. I mean, like a lot of people that come to America come from countries that they're running from because of their circumstances or the way of life, or the religious persecutions or whatever. Whereas we were moving here voluntarily and then moving on with our lives. And I don't think I have ever thought about going back. I mean, even after I was divorced, it never entered my mind that I would go back to England. I mean, first of all my friends were here. And I remember my father saying, when he found out that, I mean, obviously we told my parents that couldn't have any children, and my father's response was, well, I'm sorry for you, because I know that you would like to have had them, but he said, don't forget that friends are going to be the most important part of your lives. And, you know, you need to surround yourselves with wonderful friends, and we have. I mean, I think obviously after I was 3 or 4 years between divorcing my first husband and marrying Don, and I think that God knew that I wasn't intended to be a young mother. I had so many blessings from meeting Don and then having his children be a part of my life. His son was probably only about 8 or 9 when I first met him, and Kristen would have been maybe 13, that kind of age, 12 or 13. And it could have been very difficult. And I'm not so sure that I would have had the courage to go through divorce had I had children. But in that way, I was fortunate that I didn't have children, because it made the transition so much easier. And Don's ex-wife no longer lives in Allentown, but at the time when this was all happening, she did live in the area. So there was quite a dynamic between the different families, but Don's children were great. I think part of it was the way Don and I were. Don was always very supportive of me, and he told his children, if I'm not here and Diana tells you to do something, I expect you to do it as though I had told you to do it. I always took the view that if Don was at the house when the children were there, I never corrected them in front of him. He always was the disciplinarian and the corrector, and he did. I mean, he was and is a very good and hands-on parent. So I think that was one of the reasons why they came to, you know, we both had a mutual respect. I wasn't the kind of person that would ever expect the children to kiss me goodnight before they went to bed. I let them set the pace of making the relationship. And it's worked. I mean, we've been very lucky, but we've had a wonderful relationship. Was finally allowed to work in this country once I got the registered alien status. I first of all decided, I had a very good friend who was the husband of my best friend at the time, who was in the real estate business. And I realized it was in the by now this would have been the late 70s, and it was at the time when women were really getting into the real estate business, and I knew a lot of women in the real estate business, and I decided that this was a good fit for me. I quickly realized I had no interest in being in retail because of the hours that was involved in this country. So I decided that I would do real estate and try my hand at it. Well, as it turned out, I hated it. I didn't like it because I didn't like, well, first of all, it meant a lot of evenings and weekends. So it wasn't conducive to a real steady relationship. But the other thing that I didn't like, I used to get so irritated with people that couldn't make a decision. And it would be, you know, I don't know if anybody watches HGTV today, but, you know, you go into these houses and the woman will say, I don't like the green walls. And I used to say, did you ever hear a paint? You know, I mean, that would be my attitude. It was like, why can't people see beyond all this, you know, peripheral stuff that doesn't make any difference? So I didn't like real estate at all. And so I only did it for about just over a year. But what I did like was appraising. And I decided that I wanted to be a real estate appraiser. And so Don had a very good friend, an associate who had his own company in Allentown. And I went to work with him and eventually got because at that time, I don't know whether it's still the same today, but at that time you had to have a broker's license before you could be an appraiser. So I got I worked for the 4 or 5 years as an apprentice with him, doing appraisals, and got my broker's license, and then I continued to work with him pretty much up to the time when Don and I married, I think. In fact, I think I worked with him after that. Yes, I did, because I worked as an appraiser and until I ended up going to work with Don and his twin brother's company, and his father was still alive and in the business at that time, as the bookkeeper. Now, that sounds like a very weird transition, but the bookkeeper that they had in their business for a number of years decided to leave, and fortunately she gave them about, 6 to 8 weeks notice. And this was at the time when computers were just kind of being used in small businesses. And I have to say that if there wasn't a computer, I don't think I would ever have gone into bookkeeping if I'd had to do it with the old-fashioned ledgers and that kind of thing. But because they realized how vulnerable they were, because neither Don nor Doug or their father were computer literate at that time, and of course this was one of these big old computers, this was not anything like a computer today, they had asked me because I had some bookkeeping experience from well, I shouldn't say bookkeeping, mathematical background. I think I took that from my father. But they had asked me if I would learn their bookkeeping system. So I went for about over a 6-month period. I think I would go and sit with this bookkeeper for about, I don't know, 1 day a week to learn how this bookkeeping system worked. So, of course, that turned out to be very lucky that I had done that. So when she handed in her notice, they asked me then if I would come and be the bookkeeper. So I reluctantly agreed that I would do it for a period of time until they could find someone else. Well, they did find another person, but it didn't work out. And of course, at that time, with a small personal business, a family business, the bookkeeping is sort of the essence of the company. And so from the privacy point of view, they decided that they really wanted me to stay. So I ended up being there for just over 20 years. So that was my full-time career after that. So.
Was Don single at the time, and did you like each other right away?
No, we were both coming out of marriages, I think it's fair to say. And as I say, I was only there for a short period of time and decided that no, this is not what I wanted to do, and I left. And then we did get together then, and we had we started afresh and then went on and had a great life. So. First of all, I've obviously been blessed to have a wonderful husband and family in the much larger sense than I ever expected. Don and his brother is a twin. They're twins. So I didn't realize it at the time, but you really are taking on the whole family when you marry a twin, at least the way my husband is. And they grew up very, very close together. They went to school together. They went in the service together. They came back to Allentown, and they were both born here. Went into their father's. Their father started the company business, the real estate company, in 1952, and after the service, they both came back to the company together, and they've worked ever since together. And when I met them and became part of the family, every holiday, whether it was Christmas, Easter, or Thanksgiving, it was always the family with grandparents and the brothers and obviously the children.
Was that challenging for you?
Well, I don't think it was, because I missed that. I mean, I think one of the things that, I always say I was lucky because I didn't have that challenge that so many families have about whether you're going to the in-laws or the outlaws for Christmas and who's arguing in, or you're all running around, trying to fit everybody in. I never had to deal with that because my family was so far away that it was never an option. We just didn't do it. I remember Georgie and I, my sister-in-law and I, used to alternate Christmas and Thanksgiving. And my mother-in-law always did Easter. That was the way it was. And we always got together. There wasn't a choice. That was the way it was. Don and Doug were both born in Allentown. They'd lived here all their life, aside from being in the services and going to school. So all their friends were here. So I sort of moved into a ready-made group. Now, I think one of the lumps of divorce are that you have to accept the fact that you generally veer to, or other people, the supporters, as it were, veer to the husband or the wife And so that one of the lumps is that you lose friends, and I did lose friends. And again, there's sort of a difference. Some people, sometimes the wives are more friendly. Sometimes the husbands are more friendly. So that tends to divide relationships when you come out of something like that. But here, I sort of moved into this ready-made family and extended friends, which to me was great because I never had that many people to pick and choose to have as friends, because I just was never in that kind of a situation. And I'm sort of a loner. I mean, I'm very independent. I'm like my father in that I like to be on my own. It doesn't bother me that if Don goes away for, obviously he doesn't have to go away very often because he works and lives here, but I mean, if he does go to a convention or goes away, or they have a guys' weekend or something like that, to me, that's wonderful, go. It's never something that is a threat to me, and I mean go in the nicest way, but I think that's important. I've always had the opinion that a marriage to us is giving 100%, and you're both giving 100%, but at the same time you need space, and you can't be all things to somebody else, and I can't make Don happy, only Don can make Don happy, kind of thing. And I think it's worked very well for us. I mean,